Good morning. I'm Jennifer Widman. I'm with the South Dakota Humanities Council, and I would like to welcome all of you out there to the South Dakota Festival of Books and Young Readers Festival. We're so pleased you've joined us for this virtual 2020 event. We love spending time with readers of all ages and celebrating books with you, our favorite people. This festival would not be possible without the generous support of many organizations and individuals who sponsor us. And if you want to learn more about them, you can find them on the back cover of our festival guide, or you can find them on our website, which is sdbookfestival.com. And we also want to especially thank some very special friends who helped us provide books by Allison McGee to more than 7,000 third graders across South Dakota. And that includes First Bank and Trust, Black Hills Reads, and Northern Hills Federal Credit Union. So we thank them. The Young Readers Festival of Books this year includes about a dozen authors and illustrators of books for children and young adults. If you want to buy their books, you will find buttons on our website, sdbookfestival.com, that will lead you straight to the web pages of 2 local independent bookstores who are selling these authors' books online. So visit sdbookfestival.com to find those. So today's program features Brenda Child, and she will be talking about this book, Bow Wow Pow Wow. I want to tell you a little bit about Brenda. Brenda J. Child, she is the Northrop Professor of American Studies at the University of Minnesota. She's written several award-winning books of American Indian history, including Boarding School Seasons and My Grandfather's Knocking Sticks. Her book for children, Bow Wow Pow Wow, which I just showed you, won the American Indian Youth Literature Award for Best Picture Book. Born on the Red Lake Ojibwe Reservation right next door in Minnesota, she served on the Board of Trustees of the Smithsonian Institution's National Museum of the American Indian and was president of the Native American and Indigenous Studies Association, among many other activities. So I would like to welcome Brenda Child, and she will tell you a little bit more about her book, Bow Wow Pow Wow. So welcome, Brenda. Thank you for joining us.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. I'm happy to be with you all.
Yes. Well, first of all, maybe can you tell us a little bit about where Bow Wow Pow Wow came from, how you got the idea for the book, was it a surprise after having written many books for adults? Had you always wanted to write for children? So tell us about the birth of the book a little bit.
I think that I have always wanted to write for children. When I was kind of a college student, I used to work, my summer job was kind of working in a preschool, and I worked a lot with 4-year-olds. And I think I was someone who grew up, my dad used to buy me a lot of books when I was a kid, and not that they were fancy books or like the selection that you have today, but I was always a reader. I loved children's books myself as a kid. And then when I was working with little children, I really like that age group, kids who are about 4 years old. I love the conversation of children that age. So I have been thinking for a while about a children's book, but really what motivated me to write Bow Wow Pow Wow was there were a couple of things going on. One of them was that I was doing a lot of research in historical archives, which is what historians do. And I kept coming across a story of a dance, a performance that Ojibwe people performed before important diplomatic events. So when I say diplomatic events, I mean treaties or negotiations with the government. And the dance had been sort of misnamed, and anthropologists, people, college professors, called it the begging dance. And I knew it wasn't about begging. It was about reciprocity, which is a fancy word for talking about the exchange of gifts. And I thought, well, this is interesting. But it wasn't until I came across the lyrics for the song that was performed with that dance. And so the singers and drummers in olden times, before this dance was performed, the song they sang was, "We're like dogs, we're like dogs, we're like dogs." And so there was something in that that made me think that this would be, you know, I didn't see a place for it in a history book, standard history book I was writing, but something I think in there caught my imagination. And I started thinking about dogs and the relationship between people and dogs. Now, if you allow me to tell one more story, this was sort of another motivation. So my older kid, my son Frankie, has muscular dystrophy, which is a very serious condition. And he began using a wheelchair when he was about 10 years old. And that was very tough for us and our family, but he's a wonderful kid and a wonderful young man now. But when he was a teenager, he had the opportunity to get a service dog. And you've probably seen service dogs, but Frankie, who's now like in his early 30s, at that time, they were first giving them to young people. It had always been something pretty much reserved for adults. So he was kind of among the first generation of kids in the United States to be allowed to get a service dog. So when he was a freshman in high school, we had a wonderful dog that came to live with us, a black lab named Hunter. And I'd never really been a dog person before Hunter arrived in our household, but he was such a great addition. He could answer the phone. If Frankie dropped something on the floor, he would pick it up for Frankie and give it to him. If we went to Target, he would stand up and push the items toward the cashier, and the cashier would be like, "What's with your dog?" But it gave me an appreciation, a deep appreciation of the relationship between dogs and people that I'd been kind of reading about in historical documents. So I think all of these influences kind of came together and gave me the idea for Bow Wow Powwow.
How fun. Well, we all love a good dog story, I'm sure. At least I do. And I bet most of our viewers probably like that too. So, well, that sounds wonderful. So did you know immediately when you were conceiving of the book that you also wanted it to have Ojibwe as well as English?
I did. And some of that comes from my work teaching at the University of Minnesota, where the two indigenous languages of Minnesota are Ojibwe and Dakota. So similar to the language, one of the major languages in South Dakota, Lakota, but it is a different dialect. And so that dialect with a D is native to Minnesota. So both of these languages we teach at the University of Minnesota. In fact, my daughter, who's a college student now, is a Ojibwe language major. You can actually major and study for 4 years of your college experience, Ojibwe or Dakota. But I was interested because some of our students were graduating from the university and they were going on to work at immersion schools where teachers and students were immersed in the Ojibwe language all day long. So they were learning Ojibwe, they were studying geography and math and everything in the Ojibwe language. And I knew that there was sort of a shortage of material for them to turn to. So I always conceived of this book as being an Ojibwe, there being an Ojibwe translation is the word that I use, but it's not exactly accurate because English and Ojibwe or Dakota are very different languages from one another. And so we, for the book project, we got in contact with this wonderful man, Gordon Jourdain, who teaches and works with little kids in the Duluth public school system. And he did a parallel story in Ojibwe. So he didn't exactly translate. He read the story I had written, and then he came up with a parallel story. It's very similar, the two texts, but that was sort of what was necessary. And he's a native speaker of Ojibwe, and so that was very helpful to us. So there is this Ojibwe version of it that, and I think the book is kind of for anybody, but if you're studying American Indian languages, and especially Ojibwe, which is a very widespread language in the US and Canada, I hope that that's something that young people will use as well as teachers in their classrooms.
Sure. Now, do you speak Ojibwe at all?
Well, I guess you would say I've been kind of a student of it because I'm up here in Bemidji today where I went to college and they have an Ojibwe language program there. but my route in life was to kind of be a historian, and so I guess I would say that it kind of skipped a generation with me, because my grandparents spoke Ojibwe. My grandfather did not speak English. My mother and all her siblings spoke Ojibwe. But by the time my cousins and I came along, we kind of grew up in an English-speaking world. We watched TV, and so it wasn't, something was changing and at that time. And so it's very happy, because I think I have been we've been concerned because of the declining number of speakers. So it makes me happy when I see our students at the University of Minnesota making a real commitment to maintaining the language, because we need that. Now, I regret, if I had one, I'm not a big regret person. If I have one regret in life, I should have spent more time with my grandmother growing up. I should have just lived with her for years, because she was a wonderful speaker of the Ojibwe language. And I know there's a richness that I think I kind of missed out on. So if any of you have, take advantage of that opportunity and spend a lot of time with your grandparents when you're young, you'll never regret it later in life.
That is excellent advice. We can learn a lot from our
Yeah.
grandparents, and even though you didn't, you were speaking primarily English, and did you have Ojibwe stories, legends? Were your grandparents or parents or anybody, was that part of
Yeah.
just family time? Or
Yeah, so like I say, because my grandmother spoke Ojibwe, and a lot of people think, I wrote about boarding schools in my first book. My grandmother was a boarding school student. She had gone to Flandreau School in South Dakota back in the early 1920s. And so I would say that even though she had been to a boarding school, she came back to Red Lake. It was a community at the time she was growing up where the everyday language was Ojibwe. And so at Red Lake, where I'm from in northern Minnesota, we do have, I think we still have the largest concentration of Ojibwe speakers in the United States. Of course, many of them are getting old, which is why we need to do all this work around Ojibwe language revitalization. But I think that even if you're not working or living in the language every day, certainly at Red Lake, my grandmother was a jingle dress dancer, everything about life, even our, fishing and the things that people did to make a living. I think the Ojibwe culture was very strong at Red Lake.
sure, yeah, definitely makes sense. So how did you then come up with, we've learned that you wanted to include the dogs and, have some inspiration for that. How did you decide on the story? How did you come up with, okay, this is going to happen and this is going to happen?
Yeah.
Where do you authors get their ideas for stories like this?
It's kind of funny where you get your ideas, but I think it's like any kind of creativity, right? Like writing a history book is, there's a lot of creative element to doing that. And so for me with Bow Wow Powwow, I had to first come up with the characters, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
And I had this idea of it being a girl as the main character. I would want a girl as a main character. And the little girl in the story has a very close relationship with her uncle. And when I was growing up, I had a very close relationship with my mother's brother, McKinley. And I always think how crazy this was, because he actually had 7 children of his own. And I think, why would he have wanted another one tagging along, spending time at his house, there's some summers I didn't even leave his house. I was with him and my aunt and uncle and cousin so much. But yeah, so I think that uncle emerged as a character, and some of that too was that my daughter had a very close relationship with my brother, and she called him uncle. And so the other character that emerged was Itchy Boy. And Itchy Boy was actually a real dog. He was my mother's childhood pet when she was growing up as a girl at Red Lake. And so Itchy Boy emerged as a character. I knew that there was a girl in the book and she had a nice relationship with her uncle and they went out and had various adventures together. So it really was the girl that I had to kind of think about. And I wanted a name that went along with Itchy Boy. And so after a while, I thought Windy Girl, because Nodin is a word for wind. It appears in lots of our names in Ojibwe culture. And so I thought Windy Girl and Itchy Boy would be good companions. So the three main characters are Uncle, Windy Girl, and Itchy Boy.
Very nice, very nice. And of course, they all go to the powwow, and all sorts of exciting adventures ensue. And there's all sorts of, different. You've got some of the regalia, and you've got, some of the, for instance, the stall selling fry bread and snow cones and all of that. So it gives you a real sense of the atmosphere of a powwow. Is that something, can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, so I was really lucky in that I worked with an illustrator who was also from Red Lake. His name is Jonathan Thunder. He's not young to young kids in elementary school, but he's younger. He's a lot younger than me. And we kind of teamed up on this book. And because we're both from the same community, there are lots of elements about Red Lake that are in the picture book, even though it's intended to be a general powwow scene. And so he has, for example, our license plates on the truck. And in fact, my uncle McKinley had a mint green pickup truck. And I had heard a lot of stories in that pickup truck when I was a kid. And so that was an important, almost character in the book too, right? This pickup truck where Windy Girl and Itchy Boy are always loving going along on the trips with Uncle. But yeah, so I forget what I was saying now that, the atmosphere of the powwow. So the powwow grounds, if you look at them, I said to Jonathan, just draw our powwow grounds. It's right there on the big lake. And so I think he does a good job of evoking that. And I know I've heard, we did spent time with the kids up at the Red Lake Elementary School about a year ago. And I know from talking to teachers up at Red Lake, they often say to me that the kids at Red Lake really see themselves in this book, that they climb on the bleachers. It's forbidden, but they climb on the bleachers at the powwow. So that's what I really like about the story is, like you say, creating the atmosphere, which for me was lovely when I was a kid. We always loved, especially our big powwow that we had in July. So I wanted to evoke the powwow, the spirit of the powwow, the fun of the powwow, but also introduce Native kids who weren't Native to the different parts of a Northern powwow. So you see the grand entry, you see the flags coming in, and you see the different dance styles, even though the dancers are all dogs. I think it does that.
Yes. Yeah, I liked the details of the grand entry with all of the flags, and there's the United States flag, there's tribal flag, there's the POW MIA flag. It's clear there are veterans represented, which is always such an important part of any powwow. And so, yeah, great details. So obviously you had a chance, you talked back and forth with the illustrator a lot. I know that it works differently for all authors and illustrators. Sometimes there's an author and an illustrator and they don't even, ever meet one another. Yeah. But how did it work in your case? It sounds like you had a little bit of a closer collaboration.
Oh, ours was really different. And I didn't realize, because it was my first children's book, that sometimes it works that you just send your manuscript off and the press hires the illustrator and you never really talk to them because that's their own vision. And I do appreciate that. But Jonathan and I, because we're friends, and they did select him, right? The press talked and interviewed several book illustrators, and then Jonathan has this kind of great whimsical sense, and we just sort of thought he might be good for a crazy book where everybody at the powwow is a dog, or the dancers are all dogs. And so it wasn't that he was such a children's book illustrator. In fact, he probably regards himself more as a digital filmmaker. but we
Okay.
thought he had the right qualities. And because he was a friend of mine, we sat and had a really long conversation. And I told him, you know, the history of the begging dance. I told him what I imagined in the scenes, what was in my mind's eye as I wrote this story. Because writing a book for children can be a very, you know, it's a very visual experience. So even though I had in my mind what Windy Girl looked like when Jonathan illustrated her, she looked different than my vision, right? So you can't exactly have someone read your mind, but yet that's, you know, he's an artist and I'm a writer. So it was a great collaboration. But we did probably spend more time together than your average book illustrator and author might. And I did put a lot of notes of, you know, so I said, make sure you have Custer's last pop stand, make sure you have, you know, so things like, there were little elements that I just sort of thought would be great. But there were things that came as a complete surprise to me when I saw the book illustration. And one of them is, you may remember in the early part of the book, there's this scene where Windy Girl and Itchy Boy go ice fishing together. And there's a woman sitting in front of her ice house at Red Lake. And that's an elder at Red Lake who has been really active in revitalizing the language. And so I was quite surprised to see her in the book. And then, yeah, so right in front of it looks, I was like, oh my gosh, look at it. That's so funny. It cracked me up to see her there. And then later on in the book, there's a powwow announcer. And he, that is, you know, that was Larry Smallwood, actually, who passed away probably around the time that Jonathan was working on this book too. But he had been kind of a language teacher to Jonathan and a mentor. And he was a powwow announcer sometimes. And so he put Larry Smallwood, and everybody from Wisconsin and Minnesota would know him in Ojibwe communities. And so it was kind of fun to see that he appeared in the book. And those little touches, I think, putting in Anna Gibbs, the elder, and putting in Larry as the powwow announcer really gave it kind of a, you know, it added meaning, I think, to all of us here in Minnesota and Wisconsin.
Yeah, that sounds like a real benefit to how that worked. It's people, it's places. You could easily say to him, you know, I want it to be this powwow grounds, and that's what you got. So yeah.
But then Jonathan said, if you would do an interview with him, it would be so much fun and the kids would enjoy it, because he was saying, well, then I had to make fancy dancers and jingle dress dancers, and they were dogs. And there were certain things about the motion that you see, you know, in a powwow, right? It's dance and it's song. And so Jonathan added all this wonderful quality to kind of bring Windy Girl's dream to life through his illustrations.
Yes, the dogs almost look like they're, you know, they're about to take off or fly off the ground in their dance. You know, it's
you see the movement in those illustrations.
Yes. So what do you find is the reaction of children to the book usually? Do they have favorite parts that they talk to you about, or what are their thoughts?
I must say that the day that Jonathan and I spent, last year before the pandemic and everything, spent at the Red Lake Elementary School was I always say it was my happiest day of the year, because we could have been mobbed walking in that door. Those kids were so ready to talk to us about the book. And Jonathan spent his time with the older kids because he was a digital filmmaker and he thought they'd be interested in the kind of all of the work that he's doing. And I spent my time primarily with the kindergartners and the first grade classes at Red Lake, which was great. And they were so ready for us. They had done an entire billboard in the school, and they had their own dogs and their own powwow outfits they had decorated, and they had their own little stands with tiny cans of pop and little pieces of fry bread, and it was the cutest thing ever. So the kids so well, that was the Red Lake Elementary. You know, those kids knew the story was their story. It was about them and their culture and their experience. So that has been the most joyous experience I've had. But I think, you know, I've observed other little kids who, you know how kids are about their books that they read all the time. That's my book. You know, it's not mine as the writer, it's their book. So I like to see kids of all kinds reading that book. And I think it tells a very positive story about American Indian life in general. It's a very happy story about our culture and who we are. And so I know that other kids who are not Ojibwe have embraced the book as well. And that makes me really, really happy.
Yes. Yeah, that's wonderful. So if we have some children who are watching, or maybe children of any age who are watching, who are interested in either becoming writers or creating their own books, can you tell a little bit about, you know, just your journey to writing in general? Like, as a kid, did you want to be a writer, or did it come later?
I don't think as a kid I saw myself as a writer. And I do have some friends who grew up, said they wrote journals all the time they're growing up. I was like, really? But I didn't see myself as a writer. I was a reader though. And so I read, you know, all kinds of books from the time I was tiny, since my father would read to me primarily, and we would have our story time together. And then, you know, like I say, it was always sort of a reader throughout my life. And when you get into college, you read more complex books, and I enjoyed that process. I went to graduate school to become a professor of history, and you read more challenging books as you go along. And it probably wasn't until I was well into my college career that I started writing, you know, right? You have to write college essays and college papers. But it wasn't until I was, you know, further along in my 20s and I was in graduate school that I had to really take writing very seriously. And I guess I would say that I'm of the school that writing is hard work and that you need to spend a lot of time doing it. And now I actually have a class of seniors doing their senior projects in American Indian Studies. And I have a class this semester that's mostly freshmen and sophomores. And I tell them all about their writing is there are no shortcuts. It's hard work. You need to do it, just like you need to exercise your mind to do math and any other subject in school. And so I think while there are some people who have a flair for writing, I think all of them regarded as, even professional writers, regarded as a lot of work. So when you write a children's book, it's kind of funny to say, but you just don't write it out and there it is. It's such a short book. You send it off to, you know, I'm right now talking to my editor about a second book involving Windy Girl and Itchy Boy and Uncle. And I kind of wrote that this summer. I thought about it. I came back to it. I rewrote it. I sent it to the editor at the press. She came back with her initial thoughts. And, you know, we haven't even decided. Bow Wow Pow had a name. This book, we have different ideas for what the name might be. So, yeah, so it's a process. And, you know, the nice thing about it is that you're not alone with the children's book. You have other eyes and friends and editors that can kind of give you advice about things, and you try to do the best you can. But it's always good when you're a writer, whether you're writing your first essays in school or even at a later stage of your writing career when you get to college. But it's very important to take advice, take criticism. And even with my, you know, history books that I write for college students and for scholars, there I also write something up and get a lot of feedback. And so realize that writing can be kind of a lengthy process. But if you're so inclined and you like that, it's incredibly rewarding. It's a great feeling. It's a great feeling for me to have colleagues. And I have this book, Boarding School Seasons, and it's been around for quite a long time. That's read in lots of college classes. I know that people in South Dakota read that book, history teachers and college students. So it's very rewarding to do this kind of work, and the work for children is especially fun.
So as you talk about how much you loved to read as a child, first to be read to and then to start reading yourself, do you remember a couple of the books that were favorites when you were a child?
I do remember all of those books. I had a little, I didn't have a bookshelf. I don't think I had a fancy bookshelf, but I had a little spot in between two dressers. And I don't know what it was. It was like just a little spot. And I stacked my books up there. And every time I went I didn't live in a town that had a bookstore. I was in a rural area. Every time I went to the grocery store with my dad that had a little book area, magazines and books for kids, I would buy a little golden book. They're still around, but I remember just the things that everybody read, the Shoemaker and the Elves. I loved my Cinderella book. I thought that was so beautiful. And that was just a little golden book. But I loved this book, a couple of books that were kind of whimsical, and that's a big fancy word, and your teacher can tell you what it means. But I loved a couple of books that I read them to my own children when they were younger, but they come from my own childhood. And one of them is a book called Caps for Sale. And you probably have it maybe in your school library. And it's a crazy book about a peddler who has all these caps that are taken by monkeys. And it's a funny story. And so that was one of my favorite books when I was a kid. And the other one that I really liked, I still think of it, it's called Fortunately. And it's about a book where good and bad things happen to this kid named Ned. He parachutes from a plane, and fortunately, he looks down, there was a haystack, but unfortunately, there was a pitchfork sticking out of it. So it's like every scene is like fortunately and unfortunately. And so there's a playfulness in children's literature that really appeals to me. And I think I've enjoyed that all my life.
And definitely the playfulness then comes in the Bow Wow Powwow with the
It's
dog.
a very playful book.
Yes.
It has a serious quality, but it also has a very fun and playful quality as well, because it's about a little girl's dream. It's not about what really happens. It's somebody's dream. So I think that's a fun, playful touch for me.
For sure. Well, we are getting close. Time is flying, so we can maybe just say one or two more things. But I guess the one thing I would like to ask is, when you talk to students, when you go into schools, when you are at bookstores or libraries or wherever you might be, are there questions that you get from young people that surprise you, or that are really frequent things that they ask that you just know, okay, somebody's going to ask that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm not sure. I have visited kids. They want to know, where you get your ideas. I think that's kind of a common thing that kids are curious about. They're curious about where you get your ideas and how you decided to write this book. And they want to know, they might have a very specific question sometime about the book. So I don't know that there's anything that I've been super surprised by, but I always like their questions very much.
Yes, I think kids have great questions often, and really it makes the book kind of meaningful to them. So hopefully, any young students who are watching, or librarians or teachers, will kind of keep thinking about those questions, and maybe they'll even send them to you as they come up with that. We are going to end this by adding on a video of a reading of the book Bow Wow Powwow. I'm going to just share myself here. And we'll put that on here so that all of you can get a chance to look at the book and to hear the book being read by someone. So that will be our next thing. Is there anything else you want to tell our young readers before we go?
Well, I guess I would say that I'll give you a slight preview of this book that I'm writing now. If Bow Wow Powwow was about dogs and the relationship between people and dogs, the next book I'm working on with Windy Girl and Itchy Boy is about our relationship with bears.
Oh, wow. So animals again. So we'll
Yeah,
have some more playfulness, but
yes,
a little bigger animals this time.
bigger animals. Yeah.
Well, we're looking forward to that. Do you have any idea yet when that book might be out?
I'm hoping it's in its early stages. So that's an interesting part of the process is you write your book. Like I say, I'm doing a little finishing of a few ideas with my book editor at the press. And then we're going to send it to Jonathan and see what his schedule is for illustrating this year. So it's going to be at least a year away, but I'm happy to be having another book in process. And after writing a book that you're really fond of, it's funny because I'm friends with another author who's much more well known than me in the children's literature circuit. And he said to me, Brenda, you may write other books, but you'll never have a title as good as Bow Wow, Bow Wow. I was like, thanks. And that's proven to be the truth. We're going through several titles.
So you've peaked early in
I
terms
peaked
of
right
title.
away. Yeah.
It sounds like a great story though. So that's something for everyone to look forward to in a year or maybe a little more. There'll be
Yeah.
another book out there and we'll want to look for it. So
Yeah.
we'll keep our eyes open. So, well, thank you very much, Brenda, for being with us today. Thank you for talking about Bow Wow Powwow. And now we're going to move on and let all of you have a quick reading of the book. So thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much. Thanks for inviting me.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.